Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I want to begin our time today a little lighthearted by telling you about a Reformed rabbi who had a weakness for golf. He loved golf, but had such a thriving congregation that he had no time for his passion. And as he searched his busy schedule, he found one day in a year's time when he could play. Unfortunately, that day fell on the Sabbath. The rabbi apologized to God, but then he traveled some distance to find a golf course. And he went there because he didn't think anybody would recognize him there. So as he teed up for the first ball, an angel looked down from heaven aghast and said, "A rabbi playing golf on the Sabbath?" And then that angel immediately went to the Almighty to tell about it. God was so upset that by the third hole, he sent down a gust of wind that made the rabbi's ball sink into the cup, a hole in one. The angel was puzzled. "You call that punishment?" "Think about it," said the Lord. "Who can he tell?" Resting as part of life goes all the way back to the beginning of time. God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. From the foundation of the world, humans were made to work and to rest, to have a balance in life. And when God gave Moses the 10 Commandments, the Sabbath is included in those. In Exodus 20, we hear, "Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. For 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day it is the Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your town. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it." And the 10 Commandments, Sabbath is related to not working, giving all workers, human and animal, rest. And it's tied into creation. Here we are told to follow God's rhythm of work and rest. And then there's a little more. In Deuteronomy 5, more Sabbath instruction. After giving the instructions to keep the Sabbath, the tie-in here is a little bit different. The people are told, "Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord God commanded you to keep the Sabbath." The reason to observe the Sabbath here is tied to freedom. The Israelites, of course, were slaves in Egypt for 400 years before Moses led them to freedom, of course, parting the Red Sea. And over the years, Jewish leaders made rules that helped people keep the Sabbath. Jews today still follow this tradition. And with a little bit of research, I found some of the most common activities from which Jews refrain from on the Sabbath. The things that they refrain from include writing, erasing, and tearing. They refrain from business transactions, from driving or riding in cars or other vehicles, shopping, using the telephone, even turning on or off anything that uses electricity, including lights, radios, televisions, computers, air conditioners, and alarm clocks. Of course, cooking and baking and kindling a fire are abstained from, as well as doing laundry, and of course, golfing. So Jews prepare for the Sabbath in advance. For example, lights, which will be needed on the Sabbath, are turned on before the Sabbath. Automatic timers can be used for lights, and some appliances as long as they have been set before the Sabbath. And the refrigerator, it can be used, but again, there's this guard to make sure that the Sabbath is protected. So the fridge light has to be disconnected before the Sabbath. You got to slightly unscrew that light bulb. And the freezer whose fan is activated when the door opens, that also must not be used. Sabbath keeping is important in the Jewish tradition. And Jesus regularly observed the Sabbath, as did his disciples, because that's part of what it means to be Jewish. And this brings us to our text for the day, because it picks up on the Sabbath day. But I want you to listen for the clash between Jesus' understanding of the Sabbath and that of the Pharisees. This is Luke 6. One Sabbath, while Jesus was going through the grain fields, his disciples plucked some heads of grain, rubbed them between their hands, and ate them. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Jesus answered, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, and he gave some to his companions." Then he said to them, "The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." In this text, the religious leaders are just doing their job. They're the ones whose job it is to help people keep the Sabbath laws. And they were pointing to what should not be done. But Jesus thinks differently. He uses the example of what David did and the title Son of Man, so he gets to decide what happens on the Sabbath because of who he is. And the thing is that Jesus doesn't keep the Sabbath over and over again. The Pharisees had a time with Jesus because Jesus is a Jewish leader, a Jewish teacher who didn't follow their rules or customs regarding the Sabbath. And on a later Sabbath, scribes and Pharisees are actually looking for something to accuse Jesus of. And of course, they get it. The gospel for today goes on to say, on another Sabbath, he, Jesus, entered the synagogue and taught, and there was a man whose right hand was withered. The scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would cure on the Sabbath, so they might find an accusation against him. Even though he knew what they were thinking, he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come and stand here." He got up and stood there. Then Jesus said to them, "I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to destroy it?" After looking around at all of them, he said to him, "Stretch out your hand." He did so, and his hand was restored. But they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. Here ends our reading. The scribes and the Pharisees are done with Jesus. They are ready to take action against him. The bigger point here is what Jesus is teaching those overhearing the back and forth between him and the leaders. And there is great news for us today. Jesus is all about bringing what we need for this life. He hasn't come to bring a set of rules to follow so that we can keep them and be good enough in God's eyes. No. Jesus comes bringing exactly what we need. We need food. We need healing. We need a Lord who looks at us with compassion in the face of those who think they can be good enough to earn God's favor. And to this he says no. Jesus is all about bringing that which promotes life. One way to do this is to be making sure that the Sabbath is life-giving for the people. Sabbath is about what brings life to you. And we are called to respond to this in the way that we work to bring the life that Jesus gives to others. There's a book, and it's called Feasting on the Gospels, and it tells about the way that we are to respond to what Jesus is doing. Jesus is teaching, and Jesus omits a third option in his teaching today, that of doing nothing. From the outset, Jesus rules this option out. We are asked only if it is lawful to save life or to destroy it. And by omitting that third option, Jesus challenges the notion that inaction is acceptable in the face of another's physical need. According to the text, the Pharisees sought to hide behind the Sabbath as an excuse to avoid feeding the hungry and to avoid healing the broken in body. But upon revealing himself as the Son of Man, who is himself Lord of the Sabbath, Jesus equates inactivity in the face of need with destruction of life and indifference to suffering with actually doing harm. That is to stand silent when the power to heal is within reach. That is indeed sin. The scribes and the Pharisees knew Jesus could heal. That wasn't the question. The question was whether he would heal on the Sabbath, and to stay silent when all they had to do was say, "Please, heal the poor man." And the thing is that we have the ability to give life. We have the ability to go visit the lonely in the nursing home, to be on the street with the hopeless, to set up and shelter the abused, and to resettle the refugee. Our world could beat hunger. We can fight AIDS. We can educate the masses and so much more. The problem is that too many are silent. Too many are critics of those who are suffering. And it is God's desire for us to see the need for life in ourselves and to see the need for life in others and to respond. I have a story for us to listen to. The story of Robert Coles, the psychiatrist who writes a lot of books, who teaches at Harvard. He wrote about Dorothy Day. In the book, there's an anecdote that Dorothy Day, as you may know, she was a famous Catholic social worker, founder of the Catholic worker movement. And when Coles was a medical student at Harvard, he volunteered to work with the Catholic workers. He was a Harvard graduate. He was in medical school. He was going to be a psychiatrist, and in society, that's pretty high status. And he knew it, and he was proud of it. He was also proud that this person with all of these credentials, that he was going to volunteer with the poor. It was the kind of person that would sit up and that others would take notice of. And so he arrived at the premise of the Catholic workers. When he got there, he asked to see Dorothy Day. He went straight to the top. The person said that she was in the kitchen, so he went straight to the kitchen, and there he saw her sitting at a table talking with someone. And he had had enough medical training to recognize that the person she was talking to was a person who was addicted to some dangerous substance. He was disheveled. He was obviously a homeless street person, and she was sitting at the table with him, listening intently to what he had to say. She is at the table with this street person, giving him her full attention. And so she didn't notice that Coles had walked into the room. He stood beside the door, waiting for her to finish. And when she finished the conversation, she stood up. That's when she noticed Coles, and she asked, "Do you want to speak to one of us?" He was astounded. Dorothy Day was famous, and this man with her was a nobody. He was a derelict. "You want to speak to one of us?" Coles had never seen anything like this before. Humility that can identify with another person so completely is to remove all distinctions between them. It cut through all of the boundaries, all of the categories that society sets up to separate us from one another. They were just two people, brother and sister. The sister concerned about the brother. And it changed his life. He said he learned in one moment what he hadn't learned in 4 years at Harvard. That day he saw in one moment what it means to give life to others. And this is our calling, to be about bringing life. That which gives us life, that which gives life to others. May you go from this place knowing that the Lord is working in you to bring healing and wholeness. And may you respond to this gift by working to bring about life in others. Go from this place on this Sabbath day, knowing that you are God's. Amen.